So for my literature lesson, I chose the book Sit In, How Four Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down. And I would use this for a fifth grade lesson about the civil rights movement. And I would have this lesson as part of a civil rights unit, so it'd be like an ongoing thing. And I also found this digital reading that I would use during my lesson, and it's on YouTube. And I included the link in my lesson plan. So I would have this lesson be part of a civil rights unit, so I'd already be teaching them the basics of the civil rights movement, like what was happening during the time and about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and other things that were happening. And this book just talks about the Greensboro sit-ins, which is when 4 college students went to a lunch counter in North Carolina, and they sat at the lunch counter and they weren't white, so they didn't get served, but they just sat there to make a point that they should get served. And eventually they kept going back and sitting there long enough that they were eventually served like the other white customers. But I would first give the students kind of a background about the Greensboro sit-ins, and I would show them pictures of the Greensboro sit-ins and have them guess what we would be learning about. And then I would read this book to them. And there's a couple pages that I would stop on, like one of the pages just has the line, "The waitress watched and refused them. This was a sign of the times, whites only." And I would point out to them that it really was a sign of the times, that sign was found everywhere during the civil rights movement, that you always saw whites only or colored only back then. And then another page that I liked talked about the recipe for integration, and this book mentions a lot of recipes for different things. So their recipe for integration was to combine black with white to make sweet justice. And then at the very end, they have another longer recipe for integration that has 10 different components. And I would highlight this just because I want to use it later on in my lesson. But after I read this book with my students, I would want to define some words that went along with the book, such as segregation, integration, and equality, and freedom. And then I would have my students make a sign of the times, just like in the book. And I made an example of a sign of the times, which was respect my rights, just because I think that if the black people back then had a choice, that they would have signs that say respect my rights, and not just know my rights, but respect them. And then as another component of my lesson later on, I would have the students write a recipe for equality. And so I would go through the book and look for examples of inequality, and then I would like to brainstorm different words or phrases that my students think represent equality, and then I would have each of them create their own recipe for equality. So just some simple ingredients of equality that they could put together to make a definition. Then I would want to get ideas from each of the students and make a class recipe for equality. And I think that would be good for my students to understand what the different parts are and what makes something equal. And yeah, and some things that I would integrate, I would like to integrate literacy by having the students go through and look for figurative language, such as similes and metaphors, and identifying those and just using context to make sense of them. And I found a news article on a Scholastic Kids News website that talks about the Greensboro sit-ins, so I'd have them read that and compare it and contrast it with the book. And then another idea for integration would just be, I'd like the kids to make like an art exhibit around the civil rights movement, so the kids could take pictures or draw pictures or paint things, and I would want them to come together and organize like a cohesive art exhibit that exemplifies the themes of the civil rights movement.